Picture a fighter climbing into the ring against Muhammad Ali in front of the whole world with the heavyweight championship on the line. Now picture that same man, years before that night, locked away behind stone walls for the passing of another human being. And then picture him once more, long after the cheering stopped, standing in front of a jury a second time, charged again with taking a life. That man was Ron Lyle, and his story is one of the strangest, most haunting, and most forgotten tales in the history of American boxing. Ronald David Lyle was born on the 12th of February 1941 in Dayton, Ohio. He passed away on the 26th of November 2011 in Denver, Colorado, at the age of 70. Between those two dates lies a life that reads less like a sports biography and more like a piece of true crime folded into a boxing legend. He spent 7.5 years in confinement for a killing before he ever turned professional. He rose out of that darkness to challenge for the heavyweight crown on the 16th of May, 1975. And on the 16th of December, 1978, he stood before a court, acquitted in a homicide case that had put his name back in the newspapers for all the wrong reasons. Tonight, 3 great mysteries sit at the center of this story. The disputed killing that sent a teenager away for nearly 8 years, with 2 versions of events that have never been reconciled. The title fight against Ali that many believe was stolen from his hands, and the shooting one New Year's Eve that dragged him back before a judge. George Foreman himself would one day call Ron Lyle the hardest hitter he ever faced, and yet this man, praised by one of the greatest punchers who ever lived, would end his days working quietly as a security guard, far from the bright lights. But to understand how a man could carry 2 shadows of passing and still climb into a championship ring, you have to go back to a housing project in Denver and to a family with 19 children. Ron Lyle was born into a house full of noise, faith, and hunger. He was the 3rd of 19 children born to William and Nellie Lyle. Just imagine that for a moment. 19 children under one roof in an America where money was tight and space was tighter. His father, William, was a part-time minister, a man of the pulpit who also worked with his hands. His mother, Nellie, had once served as a missionary. This was a religious household built on scripture and discipline, with a father who preached the word of God and a mother who had carried her faith into the world. In 1954, the family pulled up its roots in Dayton, Ohio, and moved west to Denver, Colorado. William had found work as a sandblaster at Buckley Air Force Base. Hard and gritty labor to feed all those mouths. The family settled into the housing projects on Denver's northeast side. It was crowded. It was poor. And for a boy trying to find his place among so many brothers and sisters, the streets outside offered a different kind of belonging. Their neighborhood was Whittier, a corner of Denver where the pull of the streets was strong and the temptations of the gang life were never far away. Here was the great tension of young Ron Lyle's world. Inside the home, there were the pews and the prayers of devout parents. Outside, there were the corners, the rivalries, and the dangers of the street. A boy raised on scripture, surrounded by hard pavement. That contradiction would shape everything that came next. Somewhere between the church pews of his mother and father and the corners of Whittier, a teenager made a choice to walk away from school. And the streets were waiting for him. Every life has a fork in the road. For Ron Lyle, one of the earliest came when he was still a teenager, and decided to leave school behind. He dropped out of Manual High School in his teenage years. The exact age is something the records disagree on, so we will not pin it down to a single number. What matters is the truth beneath it. A young man, still a boy in many ways, stepped away from the classroom and out into a world that had very little to offer him. There was no clear path forward, no trade, no plan, no ladder to climb. Just the neighborhood and the company he kept in it. His ties to the street gangs of the Whittier area deepened, and in that environment, danger was not a possibility. It was a routine. This was the atmosphere that surrounded young Ron Lyle. Gang rivalry simmered in the streets. Loyalties were fierce, and grudges could turn deadly in an instant. For a young man with no anchor, drifting through a world like that, trouble was not something you went looking for. It found you. You can almost feel the walls closing in around him. A family of faith could not shield him from what waited outside the door. The choice to leave school had cut off one road, and the road that remained led somewhere dark. He was young, restless, and surrounded by people who lived by the code of the street. And in that world, a single night could change everything, could end one life and reshape another forever. Then came the night that ended one young man's life and buried Ron Lyle's freedom for nearly 8 years. A shooting whose true story he would dispute for the rest of his days. At the age of 19, Ron Lyle was involved in the shooting passing of a 21-year-old gang rival. That single sentence changed the entire course of his life. But here is where the story becomes tangled and where honesty demands caution. Ron Lyle consistently disputed the circumstances of that killing, and the accounts of his role vary. In one version, he described being attacked with a lead pipe and insisted he was not the one who pulled the trigger. In another account that surfaced later, he suggested he had no involvement at all and that he was covering for someone else. These two versions do not agree. They cannot both be true, and neither has ever been proven beyond doubt. So we present them as they are, unresolved, a mystery that Lyle himself carried to the end. What we can say for certain is what the court decided. Ron Lyle was convicted of second-degree murder. He was sentenced to 15 to 25 years in the Colorado State Penitentiary. Think of that, a teenager, barely out of boyhood, staring down the possibility of a quarter century behind stone walls. The world that had raised him on scripture and street corners had delivered him to a prison cell. His youth, his freedom, his future, all of it seemed to vanish in the shadow of that verdict. For most men, that would have been the end of the story. A promising young body, a life snuffed out before it ever truly began, another name lost to the system. And for a time, it very nearly was the end for Ron Lyle. Because prison should have swallowed him whole. And it almost did, not in a courtroom, but on an operating table, with a knife wound in his body and 36 blood transfusions standing between Ron Lyle and passing. Inside the Colorado State Penitentiary, Ron Lyle came closer to passing than he ever would in any boxing ring. He was stabbed by another inmate. The wound was catastrophic. He nearly passed away right there on the operating table, and he survived only after receiving 36 blood transfusions. 36. Let that number settle for a moment. It took that much to keep the life inside him from draining away. By every reasonable measure, Ron Lyle should have passed away in that prison. A convicted teenager, cut down in a place forgotten by the outside world. Instead, something remarkable happened. He lived. And what he did next would set the stage for one of the most improbable second acts in American sports history. After surviving, he was placed in solitary confinement for 90 days. Alone, isolated, with nothing but time and the four walls around him. And it was there, in that emptiness, that a strange kind of rebirth began. He started moving his body. Push-ups, sit-ups, squats. Over and over, day after day, he trained obsessively, as if driven by something he could not name. A man who had nearly bled out now poured every ounce of energy into building himself back up, stronger than before. Years later, in the 2009 documentary Facing Ali, Lyle told a story that sounds almost impossible. He claimed that during that time in solitary, surviving on a single meal a day, a bowl of spinach, he performed as many as 1,000 push-ups in a single hour. That was his own account, his own memory of those brutal days. We share it as he told it, not as proven fact, but the image is unforgettable. A man who had nearly passed away in confinement had found a new obsession, a fire burning inside him. And on the 4th of July, 1962, sitting in the crowd at a prison boxing show, he made a decision that would change the story of the American heavyweight division forever. That afternoon, the 4th of July, 1962, Ron Lyle was not a fighter. He was a spectator, one more inmate sitting in the crowd at a prison boxing show, watching other men trade punches inside the walls. But somewhere in that moment, watching those bouts unfold, a thought took hold of him. He looked at the men in the ring and decided quietly and firmly that he could do that too. Maybe better. It would take 2 more years before that idea became reality. His prison boxing debut did not come until 1964. But once he stepped through the ropes, something clicked into place. The body he had rebuilt in solitary, the discipline he had forged out of near passing, finally had a purpose. And there was one man who saw it in him before almost anyone else. His name was Lieutenant Cliff Maddox, the prison's athletic director. Lyle would always credit Maddox as the man who developed his interest in boxing, the one who helped turn a raw, angry young inmate into a fighter with a future. Think about what that relationship meant in that time and that place. Here was a black inmate convicted of a killing, locked away in a Colorado penitentiary during an era when the country was still torn apart by deep racial divisions. And here was a white officer, a man who wore a badge and carried the authority of the very system that had put Lyle behind those walls. On paper, they should have been strangers at best, adversaries at worst. But Lyle remembered it differently. In his own words, he said, "Matt Tax was white, and he wore a badge, but he really cared. He believed in me and my ability. Right then, I decided to be a success." Read those words slowly, because there is a whole world inside them. In a place designed to strip men of hope, one person chose to offer belief instead. And for Ron Lyle, that belief became the foundation of everything. It is one of the quiet truths of his story. The champion who would one day trade blows with Muhammad Ali and George Foreman did not find his fire in a fancy gym or under a famous trainer. He found it in confinement, handed to him by a man who simply refused to write him off. With Maddox in his corner, the convict became a champion behind those walls. But the very thing that was saving his life, the sport that had given him a reason to keep going, would soon be used against him. Because when Ron Lyle finally stood before the parole board, they would tell him not once, but twice, that boxing was not good enough to set him free. Ron Lyle was becoming something more than a fighter behind those walls. He was becoming a leader. Inside the penitentiary, he joined forces with an African-American self-help group known as the Black Cultural Development Society. In an era when the fight for dignity and equality was raging across America, here was a group of black men behind bars trying to build something for themselves, to hold on to their identity and their sense of worth in a place designed to erase both. And Ron Lyle was part of it. He also picked up a whistle. Lyle coached the prison football team, a squad known as the Wildcats, and he led them all the way to a championship among the inter-prison teams. Just picture that for a moment. The same man who had nearly bled to passing on an operating table was now organizing, motivating, and leading other men to victory on a prison field. He was not just surviving his sentence, he was commanding respect inside it. But boxing remained his truest calling. Over the course of his confinement, Lyle piled up somewhere around 25 unofficial amateur fights against other inmates, and the results were staggering. He lost only once, just once. Along the way, he captured 6 heavyweight titles reserved for the men behind those walls. 6 times he stood as the best big man in the entire institution. By any measure, he had transformed himself completely. The angry teenager who had walked in was gone. In his place stood a disciplined, dominant, respected man with a rare gift. By 1969, Ron Lyle was eligible for parole. This was the moment he had rebuilt himself for. Freedom was finally within reach. And then the door was shut in his face. Not once, but twice the parole board turned him down. And here is the cruel twist. Accounts passed down through the years suggest that Lyle was told his plan to pursue a professional boxing career was not considered a suitable path for a man seeking release. We should be careful here because this comes to us through secondary tellings rather than the board's own records. But if it is true, then imagine the bitter irony. The one thing that had pulled him back from passing, the one discipline that had reshaped his entire life, was being held up as a reason to keep him locked away. For most men, that double rejection might have broken whatever spirit remained. But Ron Lyle's story was about to take another unlikely turn. It would take a wealthy cable television executive and an ordinary job as a welder to finally pry those prison gates open. The man who changed everything was named Bill Daniels, and he was no ordinary benefactor. Daniels was a cable television executive, a pioneer in an industry that was still finding its feet in America. He served as president of the American Basketball Association, and he owned the Denver Rocks boxing team, as well as the Utah Stars basketball club. He was a man of money, influence, and sporting ambition. And somewhere along the way, he heard about a heavyweight sitting inside the Colorado State Penitentiary who could really fight. Daniels did something that turned the key. He offered Ron Lyle an official job as a welder with a firm that he owned. Now, that may sound small, but it was everything. A parole board wanted to see a plan, a legitimate future, a reason to believe a man could rejoin society. A steady job from a respected businessman was exactly the kind of anchor that could satisfy them. And so, on the 22nd of November, 1969, Ron Lyle walked out of prison on parole. He had served 7.5 years. 7.5 years for a killing whose true circumstances he would dispute to his dying day. He had entered as a lost teenager and emerged as a grown man, forged by hardship, discipline, and near passing. There would even be a measure of redemption in the eyes of the law. In time, Lyle received a full pardon from the Colorado governor, John Arthur Love. It was an official acknowledgement, a wiping of the slate, a rare second chance granted to a man the system had once locked away. But freedom came with a test, and Lyle understood the stakes better than anyone. He later recalled the deal that Daniels laid out for him. In his own words, Daniels told me, "You fight this Russian in January, and we'll turn you pro." This was the door that had to be opened, whooping the Russian. So I quit my job and trained for 6 months. I wasn't going to get beat because I wasn't in shape. Read that carefully, and you feel the weight on his shoulders. This was a man with no margin for error, no cushion to fall back on. He had walked out of confinement with a single opportunity in front of him, and he treated it like his entire life depended on the outcome. Because in a very real way, it did. He passed the test. And what came next, in the span of just over a year as a free amateur, was so dominant that the United States Olympic team looked like his rightful destiny. Until that door, too, quietly closed on him. Once Ron Lyle was free, the boxing world got its first real look at what had been hiding behind those prison walls. And what they saw was almost frightening. His amateur career on the outside lasted just 14 months. 14 months! That is barely more than a year. And yet, in that short window, he compiled a record of 25 wins against only 4 losses, with 17 of those victories coming by knockout at national and international contests. When you combine that with the fights he had won behind the walls, his overall amateur record stood at somewhere around 47 wins and only 5 defeats. But here is the detail that truly sets him apart, the fact that says everything about the kind of fighter he was. In his entire amateur career, inside prison and out, Ron Lyle was never once knocked down, and he was never cut. Not a single time was he put on the canvas. Not a single time was his skin opened. For a heavyweight facing that much competition, that is nearly unheard of. It speaks to an iron chin, a granite defense, and a will that simply would not bend. The titles came fast and heavy. In 1970 alone, Lyle was crowned National AAU Heavyweight Champion. He took the North American Amateur Heavyweight Championship, and he claimed the International Boxing League Heavyweight Championship as well. 3 major amateur crowns in a single year, from a man who had been behind bars only months earlier. He was, by any reasonable judgment, a natural choice for the biggest amateur stages in the world. The 1971 Pan American Games were within his reach, and beyond them loomed the ultimate prize for any amateur, the 1972 Olympic Games. The path seemed laid out before him. And then came the cruel irony that runs through so much of Ron Lyle's life. As he made the decision to step into the professional ranks, another heavyweight carried the American flag to the games instead. His name was Dwayne Bobick. And here is the twist that had to sting. Lyle had already knocked Bobick out, not once, but twice. Read that again. The man who represented the United States on the sport's grandest amateur stage was a fighter Ron Lyle had already beaten, decisively, with his fists. Lyle would never wear the national colors at an Olympics. He would never stand on that platform. That door quietly closed, and another man walked through it. But perhaps it was for the best, because the professional world was calling. And Ron Lyle, already 30 years old, was about to prove that even a late start could not stop a force like his. On the 24th of February, 1971, Ron Lyle signed his professional boxing contract with Bill Daniels. He was 30 years old. Stop and consider that number for a moment. In the world of prize fighting, 30 is often when a heavyweight is thinking about slowing down, not starting out. Most great champions have years of professional experience by that age. Ron Lyle had none. He had lost the better part of a decade behind stone walls. Time that most fighters use to sharpen their craft, he had spent surviving. And now, at an age when others were fading, he was only beginning.
But if anyone expected the late start to hold him back, they were quickly proven wrong. Ron Lyle exploded into the professional ranks like a man making up for lost time. He reeled off 19 straight victories without a single defeat, 19-0. And 17 of those wins came by knockout. The same crushing power that had marked his amateur run carried straight into the paid fights. He did not build that record against nobodies either. He scored an impressive knockout over Vicente Rondon, a former light heavyweight champion. He defeated the respected Buster Mathis, and he won a unanimous decision over Jimmy Ellis, a former World Boxing Association heavyweight champion.
These were established names, tested men, and Ron Lyle went through them. By the strength of that run, he climbed to become the 5th-rated heavyweight contender in the world. Yet through all of it, through the wins and the rankings and the growing fame, Ron Lyle never forgot where he had come from. And this may be the most telling detail of his entire career. After he turned professional, Lyle made a habit that few fighters could ever imagine. The day before or the day after each and every one of his professional fights, he went back to visit the men still inside the prison, the very men he had left behind. Think about what that says about him. Here was a rising heavyweight contender, a man with the world starting to open up in front of him, and he kept returning to the place that had nearly lost his life to him. Not out of obligation, but out of loyalty. He remembered the inmates who had watched him grow, the world that had shaped him, and he refused to pretend it had never existed. He was proof, in the flesh, that a man could walk out of the darkest place and rise all the way to the top rungs of his sport. And to those men behind the walls, that must have meant everything. The rankings kept climbing. The knockouts kept coming. And soon, Ron Lyle would find himself standing across the ring from the most famous fighter on the planet, with the heavyweight championship of the world hanging in the balance. But that night would leave behind a question that has haunted his supporters ever since. On the 16th of May, 1975, Ron Lyle stepped into the ring for the moment his entire strange life had been building toward. Across from him stood Muhammad Ali, the most famous athlete on the planet, defending his heavyweight championship during his second reign on top of the boxing world. For most challengers, sharing a ring with Ali meant being overwhelmed, outthought, and outclassed. But Lyle did not come to admire the legend in front of him. He came to take everything Ali had. From the early rounds, it was the challenger who set the pace. Lyle was the aggressor, pressing forward, landing his shots, forcing the champion to cover up and conserve his energy in the center of the ring. And then came the moment that separated Ron Lyle from so many of Ali's other opponents. Ali leaned back onto the ropes and invited him in, offering up that famous rope-a-dope trap that had swallowed George Foreman whole in Africa. Fighter after fighter had taken that bait and punched themselves into exhaustion. Lyle did not. He showed patience, discipline, and a ring intelligence that few gave him credit for. He refused to fall for it, and he kept his composure. The rounds ticked by, and something extraordinary was taking shape on the judges' cards. As the fight moved into the 11th round, Ron Lyle was ahead. Not on one card, not on two, On all three of the official scorecards, the former convict, the late starter, the man who had begun his professional career at 30, was beating the great Muhammad Ali, and the heavyweight championship of the world was slipping into his hands. And then it all changed in an instant. Ali found an opening and landed a hard right hand, following it with a flurry of punches. The referee stepped in and stopped the contest, ruling that Ron Lyle could no longer defend himself. Just like that, it was over. Lyle's corner was furious.
To them, the stoppage had come too soon, snatching away a fight their man was winning. To this day, supporters of Ron Lyle argue that the championship was taken from him that night, that a few more seconds might have written boxing history differently. What is most remarkable is how Lyle himself carried that heartbreak in the years that followed. In the 2009 documentary Facing Ali, he reflected on that stoppage with a grace that few could have managed. In his own words, "I couldn't believe it. I'm ahead on all scorecards. Am I bitter? Forget about it. I never took it personal. If there don't be no Ali, you think you'd be sitting here talking to Ron Lyle? About what?" Read those words again, and you understand the size of the heart inside this fighter. He had every reason for resentment. Instead, he chose gratitude, recognizing that his brush with greatness had given his own name meaning. Grace over grievance. But losing to Ali did not break Ron Lyle. 8 months later, he walked into the fight that would define him forever. A brutal back-and-forth war with George Foreman that boxing has never forgotten. In 1976, Ron Lyle faced George Foreman, and the two men produced one of the most savage and thrilling fights in the entire history of the heavyweight division. Foreman was on a comeback of his own, trying to rebuild himself after his stunning loss to Ali in the Rumble in the Jungle. He needed a statement. What he got instead was a firefight that nearly ended his comeback before it began. From the opening bell, this was not a boxing match so much as a collision. Lyle took the fight straight to the former champion. He won the opening round, and at one point he caught Foreman with a thunderous right hand, following it with a body shot so heavy it visibly staggered one of the hardest men in the sport. The crowd could hardly believe what they were watching. But this was a war with terrible momentum swings. In the second round, it was Lyle who nearly went out, rocked and hurt, teetering on the edge of defeat. Somehow he survived, gathered himself, and came back for more. Then came the fourth round, the round that boxing historians still talk about. Ron Lyle floored George Foreman, not once, but twice. He put one of the most feared punchers of all time down on the canvas 2 separate times in a single round. And in the same wild round, Lyle himself was knocked down as well. Both giants hitting the floor, both giants rising again, refusing to stay down. That fourth round placed Ron Lyle among an extremely rare group of fighters who managed to send George Foreman crashing to the canvas during a professional fight. For a man to do it twice in one round against a puncher of that caliber tells you everything about the power in Ron Lyle's fists. In the end, though, the war tilted Foreman's way. In the fifth round, he recovered and scored the knockout that ended it. Foreman would later say he believed he won because Lyle had simply punched himself into exhaustion in that furious pace. But the fight left a legacy that no defeat could erase. It was voted Fight of the Year by the Ring magazine, an honor reserved for the most unforgettable battles the sport produces. And Foreman himself never forgot the man across from him that night. He called Ron Lyle the toughest man and the hardest hitter
he ever faced. He ranked him among the 3 hardest punchers of his entire career, alongside Jerry Cooney and Cleveland Williams. Think about that praise and where it came from. One of the most devastating heavyweights who ever lived, pointing to a former convict from a Denver housing project and saying, "That man hit harder than nearly anyone." After a night like that, the boxing world believed Ron Lyle was very nearly invincible. But 1979 was coming, and it would bring a series of shocks that ended his first career in humiliation. Every fighter eventually meets the moment when the body stops answering. For Ron Lyle, that reckoning arrived in 1979, and it came hard and fast. He fought to a draw with fringe contender Stan Ward, then another draw, this time with Scott LeDoux. These were not the kinds of results anyone expected from a man who had once floored George Foreman and led Muhammad Ali on every scorecard. The dominance that had defined him was slipping away. And then came the true shock. In a single, stunning moment, Ron Lyle was knocked out by one punch from a little-known fighter named Lynn Ball. A man who had never been put down as an amateur, a fighter with a granite chin, was suddenly flattened by an opponent almost no one had heard of. The boxing world could scarcely believe it. The end of his first career came in 1980. Facing a young, undefeated, and ferociously powerful Jerry Cooney, Lyle was stopped in the very first round. Cooney would later say he broke some of Lyle's ribs in that brief, brutal encounter. Ron Lyle was 39 years old, and the sport that had saved his life had finally passed him by. But the decline of his career was not the darkest chapter of these years, because the shadows that had followed Ron Lyle since his youth had returned, and once again a life had ended near him. He was charged with first-degree homicide. The reports state that on New Year's Eve in 1977, Lyle had shot and lost his life a man inside his home in Lakewood, Colorado, just outside Denver. And in a detail that seems almost impossible to believe, the victim was not a stranger. He was an acquaintance named Vernon Clark, a man who had spent time alongside Lyle behind the walls of the Colorado State Penitentiary. 2 men who had known confinement together. And now, one of them was gone. The exact timeline of these events and how it lined up with his active years in the ring is something the public accounts describe in different ways. What is certain is where it ended, in a courtroom, with Ron Lyle's freedom once again hanging in the balance. His attorney, Walter Urash, argued that Lyle had acted in self-defense. According to the accounts that followed, Lyle acknowledged there had been a dispute over money, but he insisted the shooting was self-defense. And on the 16th of December, 1978, the jury agreed. Ron Lyle was acquitted. Twice now, a man had passed away in the presence of Ron Lyle. Twice the courts had examined his conduct, and twice he had walked free. But the fame, the money, and the roar of the crowd were gone. What waited for him next was silence. After the courtrooms emptied and the boxing world moved on, Ron Lyle disappeared into a quiet, difficult stretch of life that few of his old fans ever saw. The championship nights were behind him. The money that comes with contention had faded. And a man who had once traded blows with the greatest names in the sport now had to figure out how to live in the ordinary world. By the year 2002, Ron Lyle was working as a security guard in Las Vegas. Picture that for a moment. a fighter George Foreman had ranked among the hardest punchers he ever faced, standing watch on a quiet shift, a long distance from the bright lights that had once found him. There is no record of great wealth in these years, no comfortable fortune built from his time at the top. The steady, modest work tells its own story of a man who had reached the summit of his sport and then had to rebuild an ordinary life from the ground up. And yet, even in obscurity, the fire never fully went out. In 1995, something remarkable stirred in him. He watched George Foreman, the very man who had knocked him out nearly 20 years earlier, complete one of the greatest comebacks in sports history by recapturing the heavyweight championship of the world at an age most fighters would never dream of. And Ron Lyle, then 54 years old, decided he wanted one more chance. He returned to the ring. Astonishingly, he scored 4 quick knockouts over lower-level opponents, proving that even in his 50s, the power in his hands had not entirely deserted him. What he truly wanted was a rematch with Foreman, a second chapter to the war that had defined them both. But that fight was never made.
And so, quietly, Ron Lyle walked away from boxing for the final time. He did not abandon the sport, though. In his later years, Lyle ran the Denver Red Shield boxing gym, passing on what he knew to the next generation. He served as a trainer to a young fighter named Victor Ortiz during part of Ortiz's amateur days, a boy who would grow up to become a world-class contender in his own right. The man who had learned his craft from a caring officer in a prison now became the mentor to someone else. The gym, the young fighters, the quiet routine. This was the final chapter of a life that had seen more drama than a dozen ordinary men could hold. And it was here, in this modest piece, that the story of Ron Lyle drew toward its close. Ron Lyle passed away on the 26th of November, 2011, in Denver, Colorado. He was 70 years old. The end came from complications of a sudden stomach ailment, a quiet passing for a man whose life had been anything but quiet. Think of everything that fit inside those 70 years. A boy born third among 19 children, raised on scripture and hard pavement. A teenager who lost his freedom for nearly 8 years over a killing he disputed to his final days. A survivor who nearly bled to passing behind bars, only to rebuild his body one push-up at a time. A convict who became a contender, who led Muhammad Ali on every scorecard, and who put George Foreman on the canvas twice in a single unforgettable round. His legacy lives on in more than just record books. In 2010, a biography of his life titled Off the Ropes, The Ron Lyle Story, written by Candace Toft, was first published in the United Kingdom. It was later brought to American readers in 2018. And in the 2009 documentary, Facing Ali, Lyle sat before the camera and spoke about his life and his career in his own voice, ensuring that his story would not vanish entirely. Yet it is fair to say that Ron Lyle remains one of the most overlooked figures of boxing's golden era. He never won the world championship. He never wore the Olympic colors. He never cashed in on the kind of fortune that his talent might have earned in another life. History has a way of remembering the champions and forgetting the men who pushed them to their limits. And Ron Lyle spent much of his career doing exactly that, pushing legends to the edge, even when the final bell did not fall in his favor. But perhaps the most enduring image of him is not a knockdown or a title fight at all. It is the memory of a rising contender who, before or after each professional bout, went back to visit the men still living behind the walls that had once held him.
A fighter who refused to forget where he came from, even as the world tried to forget him. Ron Lyle carried two shadows through his life, two moments when a life ended near his own, and twice the court set him free.
He carried the weight of lost years, lost titles, and lost fortune. And still he stood, tall and unbroken, one of the hardest punchers a legend like George Foreman ever faced. That is the story of Ron Lyle, a man forged in the darkest of places, who climbed all the way to the doorstep of greatness, and who deserves to be remembered, not for the freedom he lost, but for the fire he refused to surrender.